Chapter 1. Yankee, go home. The sign was written in block letters with a black magic marker and taped to my locker. Clearly, things were bad, but even then I had no idea how ugly it would get in the coming months. Trouble had started that morning when the teacher introduced me to the 8th grade class. I'd like y'all to give a big Beaver Dam welcome to our new student from Rochester, New York, Miss Vicious Talcott. A wave of high-pitched laughter swept through the classroom. I sighed. Actually, my name is Sydney Talcott. Vicious is my middle name. Oh, yes, I see, she said, looking at the paper in her hand. Well, welcome to our social studies class. Please take a seat. I wanted to turn around and walk back out of the classroom. Instead, spying an empty desk at the back of the room, I headed down the aisle. As I moved past the students staring at me, I noticed a small group of kids sitting together, still laughing. They were all dressed almost exactly alike, wearing expensive boots, what looked like the same brand of blue jeans, and red Beaver Dam Beavers sweatshirts. Hufflepuffs, I thought to myself. But as I passed, the girl in the middle of the group looked me up and down with disgust, then locked her piercing green eyes on mine and sneered. Nice hair, freak show. The clump of clones around her burst into a loud chorus of giggles. I hurried to my desk as heat rose from my chest, up my neck, and onto my face. That one is pure Slytherin, I corrected myself. Feeling self-conscious, I looked down at what I was wearing. A black Epoxy's t-shirt with Roxy Epoxy's face on it, black jeans with the knees ripped up, purple Doc Marten boots. It was a look I've rocked for years. Classic Sydney Talcott. Looking around the room, I saw that everyone else was wearing hunting camos, button-down shirts, or designer whatevers. No one was dressed as awesomely as I was. As for my hair, I have great hair. It's straight and black, reaching my shoulders, with the last 2 or 3 inches dyed bright red, and the right side is mostly shaved. Like I said, I've got great hair. Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Reading Roll, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and it has been a while, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in a second. But first, for those of you who are listening for the first time, and as a reminder for those of you who might be longtime listeners, this is a podcast where we talk all things rural YA literature. We talk to the readers who read it, to the writers who write it, and to the teachers who teach it. So welcome. You are among friends here. We are excited that you're with us. And this is my first podcast in a couple months that I've published. And that is because I have been working 2 full-time jobs and getting my secondary Montessori certification. A lot of folks know that there are Montessori schools for like pre-K and even in elementary, but there are also secondary Montessori schools, and I am now working at one of those. It's Oak Farm Montessori School in Northeast Indiana, and it has a working farm, and I wrote a post recently, including some of my students' work, about how I've found my unicorn. I get to start every day in the barn with kids, with middle schoolers. The farm is specifically at the middle school, and I am their newest middle school English/humanities teacher, and I'm having a blast. It is so fun being back in the classroom, and it is also super, super fun to be back in a barn. Some days, the first thing that I do when I get to school is bottle feed baby goats and lambs. Sometimes I extract a lamb's head from a fence. Sometimes I help students clean out stalls. Sometimes I help rustle up the mini donkeys and pony for the farrier. Sometimes I stack hay. Sometimes I, actually, like every day I sweep the barn. I really like sweeping the barn. It's like, it helps get me centered. But anyway, so and it's not all, rainbows. Sometimes the first thing I do when I get to school is bury a dead animal, which isn't ever fun, but that's farm life for you. We have a greenhouse. Our farm products team washes eggs from the chickens and we sell those. We have our own little microeconomy where students make soap and all kinds of stuff and sell to the community. It's a really great place. It's not perfect, but it is perfect for me, and there's a lot of great things about it. And so I am super excited to be there. I'm also still teaching some courses for Purdue, which is also fun. It's really cool to see how, like, it's really cool to be in the classroom and then also be teaching pre-service teachers. There's like this through line and thread that sort of goes across the work that I do that is really interesting and fun. So I'm excited about all of these things. And that is why I haven't been able to have as much time to work on podcast episodes or updating the website and, you know, writing blogs and doing the other things that I do, because something had to give, and those are the things that gave this time. But during the summertime, I'm hoping to be able to do more. If you're watching the video, you know that it's summertime because I have had my summer shear and I cut a bunch of my hair off, and it's light and not nearly as hot as it is when it's long. So it's beautiful outside today. There's those like white puffy clouds in the blue sky, and I planted like 6 trees today. So far this season, I've planted 56 plants around my house. So it's good. It feels good to have my hands in the dirt again. The kids got to be at my parents' farm, at my mom and stepdad's farm, and watch them plant sweet corn in our little sweet corn patch, and also watch them plant the bigger field. And so it's been a good summer so far, and it's just getting started. So I am looking forward to the rest of the summer to come. And I hope that you are too, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. I hope that there is some joy in your world, and that if nothing else, the weather is good and the sun is smiling down on you. So that is my update. That is what is going on with me here lately. And so we are reaching back into the depths of time to hear from Brady, one of my friends, and also a rural person and a rural educator who is working at, I think, Hocking Hills Community College. You'll hear in my introduction of him in the segment once it officially starts. But we were talking about Kevin C. Dunn's Vicious is My Middle Name, and it was such a great book. And what I really liked about my talk with Brian is, I don't know, I tend to be really positive, and I like to think about all of the things that I have enjoyed about the books that I read, and the important things for rural readers to read about. And so I kind of wear that hat most of the time when I'm reading. And so it's really nice to get to talk with someone else, because sometimes they focus on different things. And so, he had some really great critiques and, thought about, style and, plot and things like that in a way that I didn't. And so it was really great to have our differences come together in the conversation, and for us to think about what that means for our reading of the book, and to let people know about those different things in the book. So I guess without any further ado or preamble, let's just get into the episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And I promise there will be more podcast episodes. I'm not sure. I may change the schedule. I don't know. We'll see. If I decide to, I'll let y'all know. But I'm thinking about what the structure of this podcast will look like in the future, now that I know I'm going to be back in the classroom. But thanks again for y'all being here, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, let's get to it. Hey friends, And welcome back to Reading Rule, y'all. Today, I am super, super excited to be talking to my buddy, Brian Brady, who is Director of English at Hocking College. And we are going to talk today about Kevin C. Dunn's Vicious is My Middle Name, which is super punk and super fun. And so I'm so excited to be here talking with Brian about it and for you to be joining us. So thanks for being here. I guess I should say thank you, Brian. For
Hey, of
making
course.
time for me.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. Very happy to be here. This is my first podcast. I've never been on a podcast before.
Oh, well, I
So,
hope that it's a good experience.
yeah, sure. Let's go.
Okay, so the first question that I always ask everyone is
Hmm.
where are you from and how do you feel like that's impacted who you are as a person and a reader?
I'm from Scotttown, Ohio, which, if you're familiar with Ohio, you're probably maybe not familiar with Scotttown, Ohio, because I've never met another Ohioan who's known. Actually, no, I lie. I did finally meet one person who knew where Scotttown, Ohio was. But anyway, it's a small little town right at the very end of Lawrence County, down at the very bottom of Ohio. So right when it comes down that little point, and it's a small, I guess, a village. I don't know what you want to call it. I don't know the technical term. There's about 500 people live there. My graduating class was about 60 people, and I'd say as a reader, I I think I gravitated, especially as a kid, to like fiction that took me elsewhere and like elsewhere in a way that was like I need fantasy and sci-fi and horror, like any genre stuff. I was a genre kid, and big on video games too, that were very much like transport me. I think I think even from an early age, I'd been kind of brainwashed into like, oh, you're not destined for this place. You're going to leave and you're going to move on to better things. And so I always kind of, as soon as I got a chance, I got out. So I spent most of my 20s abroad. I left uh, shortly, I think it was halfway through college. I did a semester abroad and really just didn't look back. But now it's like I'm back in the area. I'm back home with a much different and much more, I think, educated perspective on place and where I'm from and how I became to be who I was. But it really did change like who and what I kind of read. I think it really just made me a genre kid. If I read realist fiction, it reminded me too much of just what I thought was like a boring place to live. Like the stuff like even To Kill a Mockingbird, which very much set in the South, not a completely different locale, felt too quote unquote like home. So I was much more interested in Frankenstein, things like that.
That's really interesting. One of my dissertation participants is from rural Alabama. And he
Mm-hmm.
talked about how like it's frustrating to him that people conflate like Southern Gothic fiction with
Mm-hmm.
rural fiction and like rural living.
Yeah.
Like not every piece of Southern writing is rural, but for
Mm-hmm.
some reason people just when they think about rural writing, they automatically go to like Faulkner and,
Yeah. Yeah. I
um
think part of that for me, I think, is because like the Southern Gothic is perhaps the closest we get to like magical realism
mm,
in America, and I think it's a genre that for some reason, we were particularly like good at it. Like Faulkner's good. I think Michael McDowell are also very good. But anyway, so but I also do. It's hard for me to like if I'm thinking like Southern writing, it tends to be rural.
well, and even if it's not, I think people still think it is, and I
Right.
think that
Yeah.
has
Sure.
to do with
Hmm.
like history and plantations and,
Yeah.
sharecropping and stuff like that. Like I think that people just when they think of the South, that's automatically what they think of, even though
Hmm.
that's not all that it is. There are lots of big cities in the South.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I think that a lot of people conflate the two. And so it's just really interesting that you mentioned that because I
Hmm.
I think that even people who are from rural places, or even people who are probably even people from the South, like he would talk about like teachers that he had and people that he knew who would just automatically assume that like Southern writing was, rural writing, but it's
Hmm.
not, and that like frustrated him. So I just think that like I think it sort of demonstrates how easy it is to ingest a dominant narrative even
Mhm.
when you're from a place that the narrative is about, you
Yeah,
know,
sure.
which I think also speaks to your like relationship with To Kill a Mockingbird and not
Mhm.
really, enjoying it because it reminded you too much of a place that you'd been taught was not a good
No,
place or
right,
whatever.
yeah. Yeah. And I didn't have a critical understanding of like To Kill, like I have a very different tact on To Kill a Mockingbird as an English teacher now than I did as a reader back then. But I do think like back then it was, you know, almost like a holier than thou. Like you kind of read this
Mm,
book and you're like, look at all these other ignorant people that Atticus Finch, like, I don't know, he almost became like almost the supplanted urban, the educated supplanted urbanite that like
mm,
came in and was the only beacon of hope, you know.
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
yeah, you aspired to Atticus, you know what I mean, in that misguided way.
Yeah. Have you read this sort of like takes us of course from
Oh,
from
sure.
from Vicious, but I
Yeah,
want to ask, have you read Letting Go of Literary Whiteness by Carlin Borsheim Black and
I have.
Sophia?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have.
Sophia.
It's on my shelf, and they have a whole bit on To Kill a Mockingbird that it was very nice to read, especially with like their discussion of how like Atticus is still like I don't know how much we take in the context of like Ghost at Watchmen, but
Mm,
uh, Atticus was just kind of doing his job in a lot of ways, and I don't think how much of his like I don't know. I think he's more of a problematic figure than we want to think,
yeah, 100%.
especially in traditional readings. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, he's kind of a folk hero. But
Right.
it's like, oh, I don't know. Come on, there's
Yeah.
some other things going
Yeah.
on.
He's a hero for doing something that really shouldn't have been.
Hmm.
It shouldn't have had to be it wasn't really heroic. It was
Yeah,
just the right thing to do. And also in a
yeah,
system that was actively,
yeah, yeah. Because
oppressing
that
people.
right. Because To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm pretty sure they talk about this in the book too. That it's a book that can't imagine racism on a systemic scale. It's always an
Hmm.
individual issue to be
Hmm.
resolved, and if you can resolve it in your heart, you've done it. Good
Right.
job. you know,
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that he still has like, I mean, those readings never take into account Calpurnia and her
Hmm.
her relationship and that whole system. Like, there's
Hmm.
never a systemic analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird. It's always, oh, anyway.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And it's a narrative and tale that's like palatable for white people. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
It's there's the black characters are often off screen. We never really see them talk to each other. We don't see their community. And Robinson, like, he dies off screen. Like he's just
Hmm.
gone. He escapes jail. Like, gets killed. It's like, okay. And then we go back to Scout and the Boo Radley narrative, which I love Boo Radley. Love that whole bit. But yeah, it's just what a book. I get mad at it, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, what's interesting is I was just thinking about it, and this actually does connect into Vicious
I
is my
do
middle
think
name,
I do
because
think so.
of
Yeah.
the systemic issues that they are working against in the text,
Hmm.
and also the fact that one of the maybe not the main character, but like one of the main
Hmm.
supporting characters is Black in rural Appalachia, and his family
Hmm.
has been there for years and years and years and generations, and um has like pretty much single-handedly laid the foundation for the town's existence.
Hmm.
Um, and that's often ignored in rural stories. And so I think that actually does provide a good segue
Hmm.
into the book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And so I thought we could just start off like talking about, whether or not we liked it and how slash why. So I'll let you go first since you're
Yeah,
like,
sure. I think I wanted I did want more out of this book in the sense of I wanted also the I think I was under I needed more punk. I needed
mm,
more punk in even like the maybe style of writing. I
mm,
needed punk in like in terms of even there's a lot of like I don't want to say name dropping, but like dropping of all these different works of art. Here's like all these books. Here's all these like musicians, but not a lot of like the punk ones. It's like I feel like I didn't get an education on punk more so than I wanted. And like yeah, there's the punk ethos, and that's part of uh, like part of the plot, but there's all these Harry Potter references in the first like 20 pages, and it's like Harry Potter's the least punk thing I can think of, and she's like categorizing people into Harry Potter houses. I'm like, there's nothing punk about doing that, and I was hoping to watch her maybe grow through that, but I also think maybe the Harry Potter references aren't going to age well. But
I
I
wonder, there's something interesting about that, in
mm,
that it kind of shows that we can hold more than one thing at a time,
mm-hmm,
like we
yeah,
can be punk and also still, like Harry Potter, or, you know,
mm-hmm,
um, or yeah, like I think the Harry Potter thing, wasn't that something like she shared with her best friend?
yeah,
And it was something that kind of connected her to home in a
mm-hmm,
way, that was probably important to her since she was kind of displaced, in the book. So I
that's
feel like
true.
it was like a connection she had to home, and something that she was sort of like reticent to let go of, because it connected her to her best friend, which she's steadily, not only geographically growing apart from, but also, emotionally and, developmentally growing, apart from. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting.
I think, and also in terms of just like genre and like the punk side of things, I did love, and I do love like rooting for like a genre of music that isn't like academic, like the idea of her writing like a English paper about a punk song, and
Mm,
like of course, and the English teacher as like the steward, or like the, I guess the dutiful steward of the Western canon is all like poo pooing it, but it's like me as an English teacher, I would love that, and I wish English teachers got, I don't know, that it's either you're this kind of teacher or you're like a Robin Williams, John Keating character
mm.
from Dead Poet Society. Like I want someone who's just like, yeah, I'm a normal English dude, but he does play bluegrass music, which I think is fun. Um, but
Yeah, and I think
the
he wasn't like upset about her use of this song. Part of his issue was that she didn't write her analysis very well, like
yeah,
I think he was trying to encourage her to be more intentional about the ways
I
that she wrote about things.
I think he's got it, but he does have a line even later when like she comes back a second time to like talk about it. He was like, I can't, I'd have to find the line, but basically he's like, you need to find something that's a little more generative
Mm.
to literary analysis. It's like, I also agree, like, I don't know if that was I didn't fact check if that was a real song or if that's one he made up for the book. Like,
Oh
I feel
yeah, I
like
didn't look either.
Brite, I feel like Lite Brite is like the fictional band that
Yeah, I
doesn't
think so
exist
too.
in the midst of the other things. Um, so I guess that makes sense, but I feel like we could have got some actual punk in there,
Mm.
It's like, I don't know, just as a critique. Oh, I guess as a small other thing to just, while I'm on this bit, there's all this grace extended to like punk as like a transformative ethos and like
Mm.
um, as even like beyond just like an aesthetic thing that you can wear. But that grace wasn't extended to metal about halfway through. I think they mentioned that
Mm.
they're going to pull up some metal records, and the line's like, "Oh yeah, it's just a bunch of toxic masculinity dudes." Being a gay metalhead, I kind of want to put. I bristled a little bit at it. I was
Mm.
like, "Oh, come on, we have all this grace for punk, and yeah, I'm sure punk has maybe made the world a better place than metal ever has, but metal did a lot for me, and metal I
Mm.
know does a lot for other people. So I felt a little betrayed by that a little bit. It's like, come on, punk and metal, like those shows often blend together too. If you've been to like scenes and stuff, which the author, I think he's been to some. It sounds like he's in multiple bands. It says on the back of my book. So I feel like I was a little mad at
I think that's fair.
that.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good illustration of like, oh, how we, sort of like the Rosenblatt transactional theory of reading, right? That everybody brings
Mm-hmm.
their own experiences and, their life to the text and reads it in specific ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the writers do that too. So like when I talked to Kevin about the book, he talked about writing it, sort of in a way to connect with, his kids,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about like their experiences and, their experiences in Appalachia, and sort of like using the writing to work through, um their relationship and those experiences, and also writing the
Mm,
book for them so that they
mhm,
had something to read that reflected their experiences in a way
mm,
that is often difficult to find in literature. And so, like, I think that's a really, I love that you brought that critique, and I think that's a really,
mm,
really beautiful way to point out how readers and
mm,
writers enter conversations through
mm.
books. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
you
Yeah,
know,
the things that we signify as punk or not punk based on, I guess, like uh, either the attitudes that we hold. Like it's just, I think we associate punk with like, yeah, it's done in church basements. It's done in these like outside fringe places where like I think uh, Harry Potter's like pretty front, like mainstream. Like it's not like a signifier thing. But I do wonder. I need to maybe trace through like when the Harry Potter stuff jumps off because it does kind of have this like uh and I think it happens in another rural book I was thinking of, Rodders, where the main character moves away. They have a pen pal back home that they slowly leave behind as they transition into like a new self, a new person. And it's a very similar arc here. But I wonder, I'd have to go back and look. Anyway. Um, but yeah, I think I just, with the metal stuff, I was thinking, because punk, and I can think of other genres like grindcore and other things where punk more easily slides into metal than metal punk. Whereas punk in the country, right? We don't think of like but there's the Meat Puppets. There's country punk, and other genres that are even maybe more. We're unaware of them as like cultural things. But if you're in that scene, But yeah.
yeah. So thinking about other ways of like how like countryness or rurality overlap with punk. One of the things that it seemed to me that the book was really trying to say is that, or sort of like uh represent or demonstrate, is the sort of DIY, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Part of punk culture, wh- which, I mean, I'm not super into punk culture. I know just
mm-hmm,
enough to be dangerous. But that seems to be a major philosophical tenet, right? Like
mm-hmm,
if something doesn't exist, you make it. If you need
mm-hmm.
something done, like, you figure out how to do it yourself. And I feel like that is a huge, huge connection to rural living.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
and because I don't know how many times I've said to people, like, you know, making a way where there's no way. If that's not rule, I don't know what is. Like,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
figuring out how to fix something, or figuring out how to make something, or figuring out how to do something. Like, I mean, those are all
mm-hmm.
super part of being a rural
Yeah.
kid, being a rural person, living on a farm or not. Like, if you're in the middle of
Mm-hmm.
nowhere and your car breaks down and you have to figure out how to get to the grocery, like,
Yeah.
that takes some creativity and DIY.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the whole aspect of the book of her, printing, I don't think she calls it a manifesto, but like printing information for
Yeah.
people
Mm-hmm.
in the town to read about the asphalt plant and its effect on the environment, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, connecting with town officials and putting on the concert and all of that stuff. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, making things happen, I think, is definitely part of punk culture, and I think it's also part of rural culture. And so I thought that that
Mm-hmm.
was a really interesting overlap that I don't think I would have ever expected to see in a book,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
sure.
was delighted to see in this book. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I think I remember as I was getting towards the end and like I was like, I feel like I'm reading a Disney Channel movie in a way where it's like, here's I wish that maybe there was a little more, not to say it was like it was too easy to like make the change happen, but it was like, I don't know, like scheduling bands, like getting the outside band to come, getting all these bands to like show up, felt like uh, a fun way to get like all these different cultures together. But I think maybe it happened too easily. I don't know. I guess that's maybe the nature of the genre of the thing. But by the time we got to the end, when the concert happens, and like even like the police show up and say, okay, here's everyone had to come together to make that happen in a weird sort of like grassroots pulley way, that it wasn't like institutions coming together to fight this. It was very like um here are like the small stakes, small town people like putting even their livelihoods on the line. The librarian lost her job, doing this. And I wish that maybe some of that pain was a little on screen sometimes, especially like even I guess this is kind of a tangent, but the friend that starts with R, is her name Rita? I forget the friend who her family they get raided by ICE like
Oh
halfway through the
yeah.
novel. I forget her name. Yeah,
Wait.
Rita. Rita is Rita. Yeah,
Yeah,
Rita and Sean. Yeah.
yeah. Read it in the show. Yeah.
Um, and so like with the librarian, I wish that more of like because it seems like the hardest thing our narrator goes through, like, yeah, she moves to a new place, she's going through like these troubles, but I wish that the sacrifices that other people had to bring to bear to make this happen was a little more forefronted. And I'm not sure if again it's a young adult novel, there's 200 pages, so like you can't put everything in here. But
Mm.
I found myself, at least with like, what did I write? I wrote here Cindy Lou Who syndrome, where it's kind of like this. She's a very like do-goody, and I wish. Oh, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Maybe I think it all came together in like a good, beautiful way. But I wish it felt more punk, and I wish it felt more. Oh, I don't know.
Do you feel like that the adversity wasn't
Mhm.
somehow like gritty enough?
Yeah, it felt because I think there's a part of me that felt that her choosing the asphalt plant I do wish that the villain or the boogeyman, like of this, the thing was a little bit more, I guess, rural salient. I guess like the issue was maybe more. It almost felt like kind of. It didn't feel particular enough. It felt like a generic, like here's a bad thing that could happen in a a rural place, and it didn't feel real or lived in enough. I was also confused whether or not the Winters family was like part of Sean's family or not. Like I felt that was
Hmm.
because they were the family that owned the place, but yet he didn't seem to have any pull. I wasn't sure why that was the case then.
Well, because if he's the black part of the family.
Right. And it never came like if there's like this like yes, good. Like we have recognition that there's like Appalachian like communities of color. Like they exist and they're here. But again, they also still felt very off screen. We still very much were like centered with the white family and their kind of comings and goings. And I almost wish there were like chapters that went to different points of view. Like
Yeah.
I wish that like Vicious wasn't just our focus of, and I do love having the moments where she does like learn from her friends, but they come in and drop like the very pointed message and then leave.
Mm.
It felt almost like, I guess that's maybe what felt Disney Channel about it. It felt very like, I feel like I'm also critiquing the book too much. I feel like I should say more positive things.
Well, we can still
Should I
do
say?
that. I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think it's fair. And I don't know, like I guess I'm trying to think back to my reading of it. I think you're right, like the perspective is limited because it is
Mm-hmm.
Sid's.
Yeah.
She can't know how the librarian feels about her termination unless the librarian reveals her like most inner thoughts
Right.
about it to her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
she can't know about, how hurt Rita is about some of the stuff that she says to her unless
Mm-hmm.
Rita says something and they do have a conversation. Well, I guess maybe it's more like LaShawn like trying to
Yeah. I
explain to
think.
her like
Yeah.
that what you did is really offensive. Um
Mm-hmm.
in sort of like a loving but firm way. So she does mess up, right?
Yeah.
But I feel
Mm-hmm.
like when she does mess up, like all of the relationships are repaired. And maybe that just feels like a little
Mm-hmm.
too
Yeah.
fairy tale-esque, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's nice for young readers to see that in
Mm-hmm.
practice. Like
Yeah.
when you mess up, it's not the end of the world. Like it's okay to make mistakes, but you have to
Mm-hmm.
repair the relationship. Like you're
Yeah.
probably going to say offensive things to people.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're a white person.
Yeah.
Like
I think.
you're because your perspective is limited. All you know
Yeah.
is, steeped in your own privilege.
Yeah.
Um, and so you're probably going to say things that are really offensive to people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do, like you have to, like, I think it's good for them to see what it can look like to be corrected in a
Mm-hmm.
way that doesn't automatically put them on the defensive, which I think sometimes she does get a little defensive, but then
Mm-hmm.
the talks around what happened continue and whatever, and she
Yeah.
processes through it and then she learns from it. And I think that's a really good model for folks to see.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it doesn't feel like 100%, realistic, I feel like that's okay, at least in my world, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
story and it's a story that,
Yeah.
we can learn from. Um, I think I think it would have been cool. And maybe maybe I'll message Kevin and be like, "Hey, you need to write like 3 more books."
Yeah.
And
Right.
and like one needs to be from Sean's perspective, and one needs to be
Mm-hmm.
from Rita's perspective, and one needs to be from the librarian's perspective.
Yeah.
Because it would be interesting to see like
Mm-hmm.
how they connect to those things.
Yeah.
Um,
I think there was a moment I did appreciate with Rita towards the end where they had their what was supposed to be like this reconciliation moment, and they kind of talked about things, but then Rita was like, I'm not your friend though. Like at the end of the day, like maybe we can come and align on this common cause, but I just don't think we're friends. And at the end of
yeah,
the day, like I do think that's not everything's, sometimes you do hurt people to the point that like, yeah, you have lost something and you're
yeah,
not going to really be able to have that relationship. And I don't think we see that enough in fiction, where it's always like the friends get back together and everyone's happy. Of course the lovers are going to be reunited, but sometimes like, yeah, something's broken here and that's it.
mhm,
We're done. And I can't think of really another young adult. Like I thought of another example, but it's in a, not a young adult piece of media. I can't think of a young adult piece of media off the top of my head that let something like that happen.
yeah. Yeah, and when friends are so important too, I mean they're important to all people, I think, but I
Mm-hmm.
think in particular to young adults who spend most of their day in a school with folks their age or whatever. Friends
Mm-hmm.
are really important, and so um, I think the fact that she loses 2 friends
Mm-hmm.
for different reasons, and that she just continues to put one foot in front of the other and kind of like
Mm-hmm.
try to try to live out
Yeah.
her days in a way that that
Oh.
I don't know, makes sense to her, or not necessarily feel good to her, but like she just keeps going, right? And
Mm-hmm.
she keeps
Mm-hmm.
fighting for her cause, and I think even though like the obstacles that happen sort of also get resolved or whatever, I think that she
Mm-hmm.
experiences them and then keeps going,
Mm-hmm.
is also really important to read because it's really easy to give up.
Yeah.
Like the first time you're hit with something, it's really easy to give up. But I think that the fact that she doesn't and she keeps working for the thing that is important to her, um, is is super important for people to read.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a helpful reminder for me, as,
Yeah.
even as an adult. Like you get knocked down, you just get up, Shay, and you just keep going. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
all there is to do is just keep going. Um, and I think the other thing that's really
Yeah.
powerful about this story too. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Oh, I think just to add to that point that you said, like her like keeping going, I think also ties into the ethos of the book, but also the racial stuff, where I think there's that bit, it's in that conversation that Sean has with her, about Rita, saying like, for you, being an outcast and a rebel is a choice, where for
Mhm.
us it's already made for us. Where like she still chooses to keep going, even though like I am actively working against perhaps my power and privilege best interests, in a sense. Like I could, even though like she was kind of bullied, by Bethany and her clique and her gang. I think she like, well, that was another interesting thing, like to see like a character, usually, or at least just with my experience, like it's been, people make fun of you for sounding country, but here the country people are kind of making fun of the more city talking people, which does happen, but I don't think I've really seen it that much in
Mhm.
like fiction as much. But I do think that point that like she is an outcast, a rebel by choice, in that, and that this whole, it takes more people like Rita, essentially, that everyone else, no one else became that outcast by choice. And we saw, the librarian, the stakes were high for her, and she did. She lost that bit. I'm trying to think the other people. I don't think anyone else got like explicitly punished, but everyone was like, "Oh, we can't step out of line. If we step out of
Mm-hmm.
line, then we're outcast by choice, and our standards will go down." And it was, I think, by the end, then it was like, oh, teachers started like being mean to, or not mean to Bethany, but treating her, not giving her special status anymore,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. Um,
Didn't something happen? Wasn't there something with the grandparents? They were gonna like lose their land or something.
oh,
There was like punishment for the grandparents.
yeah, they definitely there was, yeah, what was it? There was something because they go to the meeting, that town hall
Mm-hmm.
meeting, and like Grandpa speaks up then too. And I think I remember Rita, or not Rita, Sid being surprised
Mm-hmm.
at that happening.
Yeah.
I do think that there was some stake. Wasn't that the road was going to like go through,
Yeah,
but that was a
their
different
property
thing.
was going to
Yeah.
be usurped somehow and they were going to lose their
Mm-hmm.
land. That's what it was. And
Yeah.
I feel like all of that, like one of the things that I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciated about this book is that it sort of brings visibility to the effects and consequences of resource extraction in rural
Mm-hmm.
places. I'm
Yeah,
actually
sure.
reading, I don't know if you've heard of this book,
Which one?
but I'm reading the Injustice of Place.
Oh, okay. No.
Um, and I was hoping that it wouldn't be like, super super deficit
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. And so far I've been underlining a ton of stuff because it gives like evidence for something that I've said a
Mm-hmm.
lot for a long time, which is that like rural people are marginalized people because big corporations, whether it's coal,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's fracking, whether it's cotton, whether it's tobacco, like whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
there's always wealthy folks who come in and they use and exploit the labor and land of rural people and they give them the like smallest of wages, and then they take most of the
Mm-hmm.
profit for themselves, and so
Mm-hmm.
they're exploiting the land and they're exploiting the labor, and so I feel like people don't understand that, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
understand the effect of that on rural places, especially when those people clear out and then the only place for you to go to
Mm-hmm.
work, unless you want
Mm-hmm.
to drive an hour away, is the Dollar General, you
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
and so you take these people who had like skilled labor jobs, whether it was in a mine or whatever, and now the only place they can work is the Dollar General because
Mm-hmm.
the thing that was exploiting them and exploiting and has like essentially, especially with like mountain
Mm-hmm.
topping and stuff, has ruined the environment. There are now more floods, there are now more mudslides, there are now like really
Mm-hmm.
terrible and like environmental consequences in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think Pennsylvania is still on fire underground because of the
Mm-hmm.
coal mining mishap that went there, and I think it's supposed to burn for like another 100 years. So people had to
Mm-hmm.
like everybody lost their homes because you can't live in a place where like it's the ground is on fire, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that like people don't understand that, and so I really appreciated
Mm-hmm.
that issue was highlighted by this book because
Yeah.
it validates a lot of kids' lives
Mm-hmm.
in ways
And
that you don't often see in literature.
there was a part of me as I was reading through, it's like, wow, like, uh, well, in like figuring out this issue, I was like, oh, it's so easy for her to like discover this, but this stuff is everywhere. Like I had to check myself, like, oh, like you just type in DuPont or like any you can look up any sort of like environmental injustice in your area. Like it's probably happened to your rural place or town.
Mhm.
And the fact that she was so like, if students model any kind of behavior off of her and do any kind of research on their own part, they're probably going to find something like that. And it's not going to be that difficult to do. And I think that's the other part that I'm now thinking about this with like the rural salience of it, and also like, ICE coming into like Rita's family.
Mm.
It almost felt like there was almost too much pull in terms of like the amount of like injustices that this book could have and can explore. And it almost like there was part of me that wished like, oh, I wish we focused on Rita or we focused on this asphalt thing, but it kind of gets lost. But I think at the end of the day, you reading this book, you're still left with those impressions, whether or not like I was satisfied with the narrative resolution of Rita and her story, whatever. But the fact that that is there for students to like read and go through, like I think in terms of like teaching this book, like there's so many like avenues that you can easily split off. It's got these easily generative like topical areas to explore that can easily apply to like uh your own places and spaces, especially even like with music. It's like she's all about,
Mm.
she comes to this new place and discovers everything she can about it. She learns from everyone, she listens to everyone. It's almost like she's the model like student of like, okay, go home and interview your grandparents about like your place and like learn about where you're from. Like she gives herself a place-based education when she shows up here
Mm.
of her own volition, really. Like there's some nudging and prodding, but she kind of does this on her own, which I think is fun and good.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take on like sort of geospatial movement and like how does an outsider become
Mm-hmm.
an insider, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
how does an insider become an outsider? Because like her mom was from there, but
Oh
then they
yeah.
moved to Rochester, and then her mom kind of comes back, but isn't really back because she's going to school and she has to drive a long ways away, which I think is
Yeah.
another really important thing for people to see, like how far
Mm-hmm.
people have to travel in order to get a college
Mm-hmm.
education from their hometown, because there are very, very, very few colleges and universities
Mm-hmm.
located in rural spaces. And even if it is located in a rural space, it may not be your rural space. And so, like, if you're from two counties
Mm-hmm.
over, but it's the closest thing to you and you still have to drive 2 hours to it, like,
Mm-hmm.
um, so I thought that was really important too. But I think sort of how she navigates outsider, insider, just kind of like we were talking about before, like
Mm-hmm.
part of her outcast nature, part of her outcastness, part of her outcast
Mm-hmm.
identity, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, is by choice, because she does choose sort of to be punk, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to adopt that identity. But the part that she doesn't choose is
Mm-hmm.
that she was from out of town.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that outside part of her identity, like she has to navigate through that. And it's easier to do that because she is white and because she has come
Mm-hmm.
to, a sort of like
Yeah.
a white supremacist town. All of them are,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, but so, because of her majoritarian identity, her majoritarian
Mm-hmm.
racial identity, at least,
Mm-hmm.
she does have privilege there. And I think that's a really important thing to look at too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
look at layered identities and how
Mm-hmm.
certain aspects of your identity give you certain privileges, or like take away barriers
Mm-hmm.
in certain situations and not so much in others. And so I thought that was really important about this too. Um, but I think you're right that there are so many things that this book
Mm-hmm.
offers that you can also offer students, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of digging into. I mean, I used to listen to students at the high school where I taught. Are you about Monsanto? And there were, I think they're still doing this too. Like there's this vying for farm ground to build solar farms, and so farmers are having, and wind farms, and so there are lots of conversations. There was lots of conversation in my rural community, even amongst kids, because their parents were talking about it, right? And they worked the farms a lot of times. And so there were all these conversations about like the pros and cons, um, of selling your land to be a wind farm, or to be a solar farm. And I think that that would be really, really good to bring into
Mm-hmm.
the classroom. And I didn't know to do that. And so I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really. But if I was in there now, I would,
Yeah,
and you could
sure.
totally do that with this book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, the train derailments, there are
Oh yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
all kinds of just like examples of
Mm-hmm.
wealthy people exploiting the
Mm-hmm.
natural resources and the people
Yeah.
in rural places.
Yeah.
So,
And I think it's important, like, especially if you are taking like with rural, I think we're pretty almost obviously going to be talking about the environment or nature in some way. But if you're not talking about, I forget where this quote comes from, but like if you're not talking about environmentalism with also like class and racial struggle, that's just gardening, right? So it's like it's implicated in all those other things. And I think this book does a good job of like everything, all these avenues, all like either the art, either the asphalt plant, all of this is so like intersectional, and it's all complicated by so many different like, it's not just here are the bad people, here's this, like okay, here's the Winters family who's also black, who's also still in charge of all these local things, their money is doing all this stuff, but also like here's all this like music that she discovers, and all the music, like, okay, this person's from here and they sing about this and they do this. She's like, oh, I didn't know this could do this, things like that. But there's so like, I think this is also a good book to show people that like everything is political. Even like everything you touch has like some rage or anger or something that's pushing you, towards doing something. And I think, at least with punk, where she's this ethos, I think a lot of people would bristle at like punk or like punk aesthetics, especially I know my grandparents or other people would, but it doesn't, it's almost like I think made palatable here. I think maybe just I keep going
Mm.
back to like the Disney Channel thing, but it's like she's punk in like a way that's not like she's not rude. You know what I mean? She's not like vulgar, doing things. She's just doing things herself. She's taking a stand for things. This DIY thing is more punk than actually like quote unquote like acting punk.
Mm.
Those are just the superficial markers of punk, where she embodies it here. And I think that's I think maybe where the book starts, where they're making fun of the way she talks. These are the superficial markers of place and stuff. And
Mhm.
that's beyond, the point.
Mm.
I think I think I was going somewhere with that, but I think that's also where I needed to end up.
Okay.
I forget. I don't know.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think also people have a lot of misconceptions about punk, and that there are
Oh,
probably
yeah.
people who call themselves punk who other punk people would say, no, they're not. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
like, sort of this idea of like, nuance of
Mm-hmm.
identity and nuance of
Poser.
understanding identity. So I think that that's all over this book too, which I think, is really
Mm-hmm.
important. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think the book really gets into like the notion of like cred, and stuff like it doesn't really quite, you could definitely get some punks from out of town that would probably, but it is what I like. She does, have that whole pen pal relationship with this punk band, and it's all mutually affirming. There's
mhm,
no, oh, you're not punk enough, or you're not
mm.
doing this, no, this. There's never enough. Uh, yeah, it doesn't quite get into those waters, which almost like leftist infighting. Like we don't need maybe that for a young adult book, but you know.
Well, and I think that speaks to your point earlier too about like the grassroots movement and how everybody shows up for her. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's another connection between punk culture and rural culture is that like
Mm-hmm.
in my experience, if you're in a bad way, um the folks in your community will show up for you. And maybe not everybody, but when, if a farmer, I remember my papa going out and bringing in crops for a farmer who was sick, or, he was out when he got his leg stuck in the corn head, he was out helping,
Mm-hmm.
because my uncle Frankie had fallen off of a combine and hurt his back and couldn't be out in the field. And so, papa
Mm-hmm.
was out with one of my cousins. And so like, like you just you help each other out because like if you don't help each other out, like who's going to help you?
Mm-hmm.
Um and so I think that that's another aspect that overlaps with punk culture and that we see like if
Mm-hmm.
if somebody identifies as punk and they're doing something punk, then like other punk people are gonna come, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
not all punk people, but that they show up for each other and they support one another because they share
Mm-hmm.
an ideology and a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that that was another kind of cool overlap between the two cultures that I had never really thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been to even just recently to some like local like down in Huntington, West Virginia, some like small like pop-up like punk shows that like people they're just in people's like houses.
Hmm.
And I had a friend who was like organizing one, so like I showed up and like it was a completely different, like, yeah, we're playing music, we're doing the things, but it was also like a meeting. It was almost like a community meeting where it's like,
Hmm.
okay, everyone's checking in with everyone, everyone's sharing stuff, everyone's like, oh, I brought this thing, that you asked, blah blah blah. There was a lot of like, yeah, the music, and that's why we came here, but that's also like an adjacent thing almost. It was part of the culture, part of the doing, and they do it all the time. And it's something I wish, like, it was just not a channel that I was like maybe had access to. I wouldn't like where I wouldn't. It's so much easier maybe to find these kind of shows in the avenues and venues now, at least for me. But back then, I don't know where I would have found like. I felt like maybe I was a little cut off from it, but the internet was not what it is today.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's a lot easier now with the internet for
Yeah.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we're coming to an end on our time here, but I did want to
Yeah.
ask you
Sure.
like
Hmm.
critiques, notwithstanding, like is this a book that you would recommend that folks read?
I think I would recommend, like, in a very particular like way. If someone was like, "What's a like? Give me your favorite, or give like your favorite or best like rural YA book," I probably wouldn't reach for this one. But if it was like a teacher, like this is a book that feels to me like this book like wants to be used in a classroom more than like I want to. This book, I think, because it's set in a school, it's so very academic in its nature. It was almost like written, at least in my mind, and I'm not sure if this was Kevin's intent, but it felt very like written for the middle language arts like classroom almost. It's like all these different intersections, but it's also like it's punk 101, it's activism 101, it's
Mm-hmm.
music 101, it's all this like fandom 101, interacting with people who aren't white 101. When you're it's learning. There's a lot of generative things like that. But if it was like I want to read, you know, I would think I would jump for other books before it was like I need like a chill. Like I'm recommending this book to my other English teacher friends.
Mm,
Whereas if they weren't an English teacher, I probably also wouldn't give them this book.
mm. And I mean, I think, all readers are different. All readers like
Yeah.
different things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if a reader likes punk music or punk culture, or is interested in counterculture, is interested in
Mm-hmm.
activism, is interested in any of those things, then um, I definitely recommend it to them. I think I would love to read this with students.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I didn't get to read it with them and talk about it with them, I would definitely have it in my classroom library.
Oh yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and I would definitely recommend it to students and for sure to teacher friends. I think I really, really enjoyed reading it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I liked it a lot. And so if anybody, asks like, is this a book I should read? I think I'd say
Mm-hmm.
yes.
I have any other last thoughts? Mm,
Yeah. And you got any parting words, any last thoughts?
yeah, I wish. Oh, I do.
No.
I did like that the idea of like a zine and publishing it like was here
Mhm.
too. And I did like I almost want like I'd love a well, I guess maybe it would be this book, I guess. Like one where it's just here's like Sean, Rita, and Sid like making the zine, like making another zine or like the idea of zine production, I think is
Yeah, and that'd be fun to do with students too.
right. Yeah, they make like a zine, right? Like that's a very applicable text-based application that they could just do it. You could make a class
Yeah.
zine.
Yeah. What do you want to
Like
make a zine about? What do you think people need to know about?
right about our very particular community. Like
Exactly.
this idea that like, and I think it was something that was burned into my head as like a as an English student. Like if it wasn't canonized or like published officially or like uh, didn't have some like institutional backing, it wasn't like worth reading or wasn't like good.
Mm,
But it was a very like elitist, horrible way of thinking that thankfully like I've gotten out of. But I was taught that way, especially like in my undergrad with like literature and stuff and the canon and theory, all this stuff. It was a
mhm,
very you had to unlearn. It was just crazy to unlearn the stuff you go to college and learn. But
mhm.
welcome to the system.
Yeah. Again, we live in a system
Yeah, yeah,
that
we live in
privileges
a
certain
system.
people and certain ideas and certain ways of
Yes,
writing those ideas.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's unfortunate. So
Well,
yeah, I'll check it out.
thanks so much for
Of
having
course,
this
yeah,
conversation with me and,
yeah,
being critical and
yeah,
being able to challenge each other in the way that we,
yeah,
thought
sure,
about and
yeah,
read the book. It's super fun. And I really appreciate you taking the time. So thanks for
of
being
course.
here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was a joy. I like talking. I don't get to talk about books as much anymore.
I know I
Thank
don't
you.
either, which is
I
why
know,
I'm
right?
really, really loving this.
I know. Yeah, it's a whole thing. It's a joy. It's thank you for giving me the space to do this.
And if you ever want to do it again, just let me
I
know.
will